In October of 2023, in a town of about 12,000 people on the Alabama-Florida line, a newspaper publisher and her reporter were arrested and charged with felonies for publishing a story. 4 centuries after the fight this week is about, the limit is written down. The arrest happened anyway. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is the interview episode for week 9 of our series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. This week, we have been with the levelers, printers and pamphleteers who thought the limits on power should be written down and published without anyone's permission. Today, I sit down with Brendan Kirby, who has spent 30 years finding out what those written limits mean and what they are worth in practice. This conversation is the capstone of the week. This past Sunday, we published the written piece on our website. On Saturday, we told the history and the compelling stories of young men like Freeborn John, Overton, and Walwyn in the time of English Civil War. On Tuesday, we brought it into the present with a difficult analysis of our own Fifth Amendment, which owes its lineage to Lilburne himself, among others. And now, on Thursday, we close the week with a living voice. And rather than theorize about the distance between a document and its enforcement, I went to a man who measures that distance for a living. Brendan Kirby is an investigative reporter with FOX10 News in Mobile, Alabama. I will say he is the perfect guest for this particular week. He covers the courts. He has covered them for 30 years, first in the Mid-Atlantic states and now on the Gulf Coast, a beat that straddles 2 states with nearly identical open record statutes and completely different habits about obeying them. The levelers did not only want liberties, they wanted them written and placed where no majority could reach them. The agreement of the people was an attempt to bind Parliament itself, with certain matters reserved out of its hands entirely. And at Putney in 1647, they argued about who gets a voice in the government he lives under, and they never settled it. 2 threads to follow today. The first is what it costs now to be the one who puts something on the record. And the second is the objection the levelers' opponents raised, which was serious. Once you write the limit down, somebody has to say what the words mean, and that authority has to sit somewhere. Brendan gives us his thoughts on those objections. And one note, both matters we discuss involve local officials in a county where one party controls nearly everything. And this show does not convert either into a partisan story. Brendan does not endorse candidates and does not advocate policy. What is under examination is a mechanism, not a team. So keep our standing question in mind as you listen. Did this leave Americans more free or more governed? So let us get to it. Here is my conversation with Brendan Kirby.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions Podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
I'm very pleased to be joined today by my very good friend, Brendan Kirby, who is an accomplished journalist of over 30 years. We've been friends for a long time. And Brendan, you've been covering both national and local politics, the justice system, law enforcement issues, immigration, whole host of other topics. I know that you've won a number of journalism awards, and most recently you've been covering Mobile's Government Plaza, which contains the city and county offices, as well as the courts. And then you're also an investigative reporter with FOX10 News in Mobile, Alabama. You live in Daphne. You have a wonderful wife, Carrie, and 2 wonderful children who are now grown. And Brendan, you are the author of Wicked Mobile, a pop history book that examines the rogues and scoundrels of Mobile over the past 300 years. I also know that Brendan is a rabid sports fan of Philadelphia sports, including those dreaded Flyers. So
I knew that was going to hurt you to say.
So we'll get into all of that, but I want to thank you for giving up part of your afternoon to join us on this series. I really look forward to sharing your experience and insights with our audience. 30 years in a business that's changed so dramatically within that time. And then also geographically, you've gone from Philadelphia and Maryland down to the Gulf Coast. You've been in newspapers and television. And I think pretty much through that entire time, you've also been in courtrooms and seeing it from the inside. And that's really where I want to start today and start to tie it into our series. Most people, they don't really understand what the job is for a reporter. They see it, but they don't actually understand what it consists of. And you being in a courtroom constantly, the average person is in one once, maybe twice in their life. And if they are, they want to avoid going in at all costs. So if you could just kind of start us there, take us back to the beginning of it. What made you want to be a reporter, and what's kept you in it for 30 years?
I think I wanted to do this from the time I was in fifth grade, and I started a newspaper for my school in fifth grade. And I think what it just comes down to is just storytelling. I like telling stories, finding out interesting things, and telling other people about it. I mean, is just kind of the basic calling of it. You get to do interesting things. That the day is different. There are different places you're running around. I've covered hurricanes. I've courtrooms, obviously. So there's a lot of variety to it that you wouldn't necessarily have on an office job or a sales job or something where you're doing the same thing over and over.
What is it about a courtroom? What do you get out of being in the courtroom and covering a story that you just can't get from, kind of reading the transcript of it or getting it secondhand?
It's there. Every case is a mini drama, and this is really unlike most other stories in journalism. You go to a city council meeting, they pass ordinances and resolutions, and some of them have an effect on your individual daily lives. Others don't. But no one's going to die. Whereas in court, especially a state like Alabama where we have the death penalty, in some of those cases, it is literally a story of life or death, and the drama of it always just fascinated me. I've covered a lot of murder trials, a lot of violent crime trials, and invariably you have the prosecutor and the defense and the defendant, and they are up in front of the judge on either side of the courtroom, and then behind them in the pews, you usually have the family of the victim on one side, the family of the defendant on the other side, and they're almost always separated physically like that. And everyone in a trial is going through the same event, and it's very tense and very awkward, and these families see each other in breaks, and to me it's a small miracle that you don't have more commotion that breaks out. Occasionally you do. Occasionally you'll have members of one side and the other will get into a shouting match, and the courtroom deputies will have to intervene, but usually not. When you get to a courtroom, almost always people obey the authority. They obey the judge. The judge tells them to do something, and they do it. And I think that's why the system works. And by the way, I think juries do too, because it is extremely rare, and in Alabama, virtually unheard of, for a jury to be sequestered. You see this on TV, right? We're putting you up in the hotel. That almost never happens just because of the cost involved. So even on a capital murder case, those jurors go home at the end of the day. They go home for the weekend. They come back, and they're not supposed to consider anything except what they hear in that juror box. And the judge says, don't do any independent research about this. Don't read the newspaper. Don't watch television about it. And in this day and age, don't do your own research on the internet, which wasn't an issue when I first started doing this. And I think for the most part, they obey that. I think there's a lot of cynicism in the public that actually works, because, of course the jurors are looking at it. The human temptation is too strong. Of course they're talking about, and I think for the most part they don't. The judge is up there it's an authority figure in robes and they say, don't do this. And I think for the most part, they don't. And my experience has been that juries usually get it right. And they're the only ones that hear all of the evidence, which is why I always try to avoid trying to second guess juries, especially on cases that I know just from the news coverage or even ones I've covered. Because even as a reporter, we're usually not there for the entire trial. We're popping in and out. The only ones who are the participants and the jurors. And I just think it's a great system. And I wonder, a lot of people, tend to, I think, diss juries and, you don't get on a jury unless you are a moron. You hear this a lot. But I don't think that there's any greater substitute for liberty than having 12 people who have no stake in something, don't know the people involved. That is so much better than if judges made these decisions or you had professional jurors or anyone with any kind of a stake in the system. I mean, we're up to judges. Judges, face a pretty good deal of political pressure that a juror just doesn't, because at the end of the trial, the juror's going home to his individual life, and he's not benefiting or suffering any consequences one way or the other.
Wow, that's a fantastic point. What about regionally? You mentioned about the difference being in Alabama, and I know you cover Alabama and the Florida Panhandle, but you've also covered stories in Maryland, and you grew up in Pennsylvania. Do you see things culturally different in the courtroom or in the justice system between those areas?
Yeah, I don't think that they're, in terms of the way justice is administered, I don't think that there really is. In terms of the rules, for the media, there certainly are. Other states are much more open to the public. We all have public trials, obviously, and they're all open. But in many states, Florida included, you can have cameras in the courtroom, and people can actually see these trials. And here you just, in Mobile, we are allowed to film through the door without sound. So you can kind of see what's going on, but you can't hear any of it. And it's one thing to read an account of what was said in the courtroom. It's another thing to actually see it and hear it. And so many times I've been covering something and someone, a lawyer, a litigant, someone will say something in court and I'll say, wow, I really wish I had that on camera, because you talk to them afterwards and, invariably they never say it as well when they're being interviewed on camera than they say it in the moment. But in terms of how it works, I don't think it really is. I think, like I said, I think jurors are conscientious, wherever they are. I think they try to get it right. They pay, very rarely have I ever seen a juror not paying attention. They pay attention. They take notes. They try to do their best. In some cases, they're going to be very complicated legal instructions from the judge, and some of the cases can be very technical. But I think they try well, and the prosecutors don't always win, and I think that is good. In the federal system, the prosecutors do almost always win, and that's because they can pick and choose their cases. If the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't really like a case, they just decide we'll let the state handle this. Whereas your local DA just takes anything that comes through the door, and so they have some dog cases that they have to try to make. So I don't think you want a system where the government always wins. I mean, there's probably something wrong if the government is always winning, because you don't always get it right.
I know many libertarians in our audience are nodding their head along with that statement for sure. Let me bridge this a little bit to where our audience has been this week on the show, because I think it lands quite close to your work, and it's definitely one of the reasons why I wanted you to have specifically this week to help us go through this topic. Our series, we're tracing the lineage of the idea of liberty on the road to 1776. And where it actually came from. And this week, we're in England. We're talking about the English Civil War. We're talking about a group of enemies called the Levelers. And they were printers, pamphleteers mostly. And this episode opens on a spring morning in 1638 with Lilburne tied to the back of an ox cart, whipped for 2 miles through London, and then he's locked in the pillory at Westminster. And here's what he had done. He had brought unlicensed books into England, and Star Chamber hauled him in, and they asked him to swear an oath to answer truthfully whatever the court chose to ask of him, including whatever would convict him out of his own mouth. And to that, he refused. He said, no man is bound to accuse himself. He was never actually charged with a crime. He was whipped and pilloried and imprisoned for refusing to answer a question. And bleeding in the pillory with a gag in his mouth, let me make this as dramatic as possible, he pulled out pamphlets out of his pockets and he threw them into the crowd. And I think this runs directly to you. The right against self-incrimination is not a resemblance. It is a documented line from Lilburne into common law and then eventually into the Fifth Amendment. And when the Supreme Court wrote Miranda, it reached back through the same 17th century fight. So Lilburne was whipped through 2 miles of London for refusing to answer a question, and the court treated the refusal itself as proof of guilt. You've watched juries and courtroom galleries react to people invoking the Fifth for 30 years. What does an invocation actually mean? And what do most people in the public get wrong about it?
I think that there's a tendency for people to think if you don't have anything to hide, then you should get on the stand and answer questions. And it's kind of a natural human instinct, right? I haven't done anything wrong, so therefore I'm not going to incriminate myself because I haven't done anything wrong. And the only person that would avail themselves of that kind of a protection is someone who does have something to hide. But I think there's an important liberty component to this that people don't think of. You can get in trouble for what you say if it's false, or if the charging authorities believe it is. If it doesn't jive with their understanding of the facts of a situation. And I think we've seen people in these independent counsel probes in Republican and Democratic administrations who have gotten caught up, and you've had these long, expensive investigations that have produced no convictions on the merits of what was being investigated, but a string of people who have gone to prison because they have committed perjury, or prosecutors believe they've committed perjury. So I think that's the greatest protection. If you say something that is wrong because your memory fails you, or you have a different interpretation of what happened than somebody else, you can get in trouble for that. So I think it is an important right. It certainly is an important right in a courtroom. Kind of going along with this, criminal defendants have an absolute right not to testify in a trial. And by the way, most don't. On television shows and movies, almost always they do. In real life, almost always they don't. Or at least I'd say maybe 70% of the time. It's rare for a criminal defendant to get up on the stand, because there's a lot of reasons for that. For defense lawyers, I think they consider it a big risk, particularly depending on who their defendant, who their client is. If it's a client who has a history of criminal offenses, some of that can come out on cross-examination that ordinarily wouldn't. But sometimes lawyers just don't think that their clients would make good witnesses, sympathetic witnesses, just based on who they are. And I've always wondered about that with juries, because juries are always instructed. This man is innocent. You are to presume him innocent. That is an actual fact that the jury is supposed to accept, along with everything else, is that he's innocent, and he doesn't not become innocent unless the government proves beyond a reasonable doubt that he's guilty. And so therefore, the defendant has no obligation to put on any defense at all. I mean, it's not just that the defendant doesn't have to testify. They don't have to put on any witnesses. And in a lot of trials, they don't. All of the defense comes out in cross-examination of the prosecution witnesses, and they don't put on any independent defense. I wonder how jurors view that. Because I think, to me, I think if I were a juror, even though I'm told not to, human nature is. I think jurors want to hear from the person accused. I think they want to see the guy come up and take the stand and take the oath and say that he's innocent and why. So, I think it's a strategic consideration that defense lawyers always have to keep in mind, that this isn't just rights and constitutional law, but how are ordinary people going to perceive this? And it probably differs depending on the facts of the case.
Yeah. You mentioned about TV shows and movies too, and I'm constantly reminded of the great movie My Cousin Vinny, and where they say, and it's inflection, right? What's written in the transcript is "I shot the clerk," but he's saying it in a questioning way. "I shot the clerk," and that doesn't come across that way. So defendants can make legitimate mistakes in their inflection, in their tone, in their understanding of the questions, and all these things can lead to being marked as the criminal, as guilty, when they could absolutely be completely innocent. And I think
and a whole lot of criminal defendants have gotten themselves in trouble over the years because they tried to talk their way out of a situation. And I think that includes defendants who didn't do it and figure it's okay to talk to the police because they didn't. But just as a matter of practicality, if you ever find yourself in a situation where a police officer wants to ask you questions and you think there's in any way a chance that you could be a suspect in it, you're better off not saying anything, getting a lawyer, and then going from there. And people don't want to do that, I think, because if you say, "I'm not going to answer your questions, I want a lawyer," again, human nature being what it is, the police are going to focus on you even heavier at that point. Even if they didn't consider you a suspect, if you're all of a sudden saying, "I'm taking the fifth," I think you're going to get, more scrutiny than you would otherwise.
Yeah, I agree. The other part of our historical episode, we talked about in 1649, Cromwell put down a mutiny, and he locked 340 men in a church at Burford for 3 days without telling them what was coming. And what I've kind of found interesting about that whole piece of history is that one of them found something sharp, and they scratched into the wood their name, Anthony Sedley, 1649, prisoner. It's still there. You can go see it today. And what it makes me think of, and at that same time, there were 3 prisoners that were shot. There's a plaque out there now to kind of make in memorial of that event. This was a man with nothing left making a record anyway. And because the record is the only thing that outlives the people who want it gone. And I think, it's a fair description of what you do. You write, you publish. You published a book, Wicked Mobile, 300 Years of Cities, Rogues, and Scoundrels, and it's permanent, and whether anybody wanted it written or not. So I'll ask you the leveler question in your own terms. When you put something on the record that somebody powerful did not want on the record, what do you think that actually costs, and who ends up paying for it?
Well, fortunately, I've never had to pay any kind of great cost at all. The worst that's happened to me is people have been angry about what's been published, and I've gotten angry emails or phone calls, and that's about the. I've never been thrown in jail. I've never been threatened to be held in contempt. I've never been sued for libel. Actually, I guess. Technically, I was sued for libel years and years ago, along with the newspaper I worked for and a whole bunch of other people, because I had reported factually that this man who had been convicted of DUI had been charged many times before, and he took offense to me publishing. I didn't even realize that I had been named in this suit until after it was dismissed. But I've never had any, great price that I've had to pay, and obviously, and at various points in history, and even still today in certain countries, journalists are paying with their lives for this kind of thing. I've never had anything close, so I'm fortunate about that. But I think that is the crux of what is journalism. I think that's what it is. That one of the best definitions I ever heard of journalism, I forget who said it, was journalism is telling people things that people in power don't want them to know. And everything else is just public relations. And I think that oversimplifies it maybe a tad, but that's journalism. It's one thing repeating a press release, that you get. There's probably good information in those people need to know, but that's not really journalism. I think journalism is getting at things that the people in power don't really want you to know. And some of our best journalism has been when people have learned things about their government that the government tried very hard to keep them from knowing. And whether that is because it was a state secret in the highest example of this, or just something that a local county commission or city government has just tried to hide because it's embarrassing. I mean, I think that's the role.
Yeah, yeah. One of the other interesting notes about that time period in history in the mid 17th century was the advent of technology. And one of the reasons why the levelers had a movement is because the licensing system collapsed, cheap print flooded the country. And there's a famous story about a London bookseller named George Thomason who saved a copy of everything and ended up with 22,000 items in a country of 5 million people. Today, publishing is essentially free, and yet there are fewer working reporters than at any point in your career.
Right. And that's because the economic model was broken. Right. It used to be if you wanted to reach a mass audience in print for hundreds of years, there was only one real way to do it. You had to buy an ad in a local newspaper, and printing presses were very expensive. So there was a barrier to entry that was very high. And if you were fortunate enough to own a printing press, it was like owning a money machine. And so, somebody described it this way. You had the kid who wanted to buy a bicycle, and the guy who was trying to sell his car, and the guy who was trying to find a summer job, and a million other examples. Were all reaching each other through this newspaper medium, and none of them really thought very deeply about the role of the press or the need of free information in a free society or anything larger than that. They were just trying to achieve their means, and it just so happens that the economic model aligned with journalism and publishing. And I think there was this assumption that this would always kind of last. I mean, we had it for hundreds and hundreds of years, and newspapers, every time something came along that was supposed to push them aside, radio, television, cable, all came and went, and newspapers stayed. And the internet was just fundamentally different. And I think part of it is because of that barrier. Television stations came along, and they were competition, but they were limited by the bandwidth. You could only have so many televisions, and tightly regulated by the FCC. They decided who got to own one of these broadcast licenses. They had rules on them. Now you don't. So, this is kind of the wild, wild west where instead of having to get some big company to decide to take a risk on Jeff Kellogg and put his show on the air someplace, can just do it himself for, very cheaply to almost nothing. Anyone can do this. And that's why you have just a lot of stuff out there. People can just publish stuff on their own Facebook page and reach thousands of people in some cases. So it's kind of democratized information. And in addition to breaking the business model, which is never going to be put back, unless we have an electromagnetic pulse that puts us back to the 19th century and we have to just start, printing again. And that's all we have. This is just the world we live in. A lot of my brethren are really upset about this, and even just beyond the economics of it, people are aghast that the gatekeeper role of journalism is gone now. And there was a value to that. I think. I mean, there's certainly a benefit to having some sort of gatekeeper role to say this is important and this is not. But we're being humble about it. That misses stuff too. Stuff gets out there now that wouldn't otherwise. It is still legitimate. At the end of the day, you just have to rely on the market and the public to decide what's important and what's not. And that's scary to a lot of people. It's scary to a lot of journalists because they don't necessarily trust the public to make the right decision about that. And conspiracy theories, go wild, and But there's not really a practical solution for that. I have a friend in journalism who thinks that we need more media literacy. That's the problem. People don't know what they're reading, and they need to be more literate. And I don't know what the practical application of that is. Making everyone take a media literacy course isn't going to stop what he's upset is occurring. People gravitate to what they want to hear, and you can tell them this isn't a reliable source, and that's probably not going to do any good. So we just have to trust the market, I guess, like we do from everything else. But from an economic standpoint, we have fewer people with the resources to ferret things out, because to do important journalism, it does take some resources, and it takes more than just someone getting on Facebook and giving their opinion about something. Information can be very difficult to actually ferret out, and sometimes it requires spending a lot of money to get it. And I think that's the biggest loss we've had in the last 25 years.
Yeah, yeah, and risk, and speaking of risk for publishers, you're working on a story. I know you've covered it on the Alabama-Florida line. There was a reporter who published at a weekly paper, arrested and charged with felonies for publishing a story. I want to ask you about that, because that to me, right off the bat, seems like a First Amendment violation. But start wherever you want with this. What kind of town is this? What happened? What's going on there? What did they actually publish?
Okay, so this was in Atmore, Alabama, which is northeast of Mobile, in a county called Escambia County. The county has about 36,000 residents or so, and Atmore, I think it probably has about 12,000 or so. So it's a small rural place. It borders Florida. Confusingly, it borders Escambia County, Florida, which is where Pensacola is. And then this is Escambia County, Alabama. I always thought that the state should really get together and have them not give the same name to counties that are bordering each other. And it's too far away from Mobile to be a suburb. It's really too far away from Pensacola even to probably be a suburb, although you probably have some people that are driving down for jobs there. So it's kind of its own place. And small towns are famous for small town politics, and that's what you have going on here. And this was the genesis of this was an investigation that this paper was doing in the possible misuse of COVID relief money that flowed to the school system there. So this is obviously a legitimate interest of public importance. As you know, we spent a lot of money after COVID on a lot of things, and a lot of it got stolen or wasted. It's not as conspiracy theory. So that's what they were looking into. And this is complicated by the fact that the publisher of this newspaper is also a school board member. And so you have these interconnecting relationships in a small town that you wouldn't have in a bigger city usually. And then it was a divided school board, and there was a pro-superintendent faction and an anti-superintendent faction. And so that is the context of this arrest that the sheriff's office and the district attorney's office made of the publisher and the reporter after this story ran. And they were accused of violating grand jury secrecy, which is a crime. Prosecutors take grand jury secrecy very seriously. Just as a side story, a public information officer for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Mobile actually got prosecuted, charged with a crime by his own office because a TV station had reported that the grand jury that was investigating a local corruption case had taken a hiatus, had taken a break. It wasn't even anything substantive about what the grand jury did, and he didn't just lose his job, but they actually charged him with a crime. So that is to say, if you're a journalist and you find out something that a grand jury has done before it's publicly reported, you are taking a risk in reporting that. And that was the allegation here. Now, I'll say that The journalists involved here deny that that's what happened. That they've not admitted to that. And their contention is that these were all just trumped up, and that's because the DA and the sheriff, were intervening on one side of this local dispute over whether the superintendent should stay or go, and that was the genesis of it. So we'll see how that plays out. The charges ended up getting dropped, so they don't face any criminal liability anymore. And then they sued, and there's an active lawsuit in the federal district court in Mobile, where this is being litigated out right now. Where it is right now is the judge issued a ruling, dealing with whether the DA had immunity. You hear a lot about qualified immunity in a law enforcement context. The argument here is when a prosecutor, you can't sue the prosecutor because you don't like an action that the prosecutor has taken, and even if the action is invalid, or the arrest ends up not being a valid arrest or something like that, you can't go and hold the prosecutor civilly liable for that, because they need the flexibility to be able to do their job and administer justice without looking over their shoulder. Same argument essentially that you get with you can't sue a cop because he shoots someone in the line of duty, because there's broader ramifications for that. So anyway, this issue came before the judge, and he essentially split the difference. He said that the DA was immune from any actions that he took as a prosecutor. So anything having to do with anything involving the grand jury, his grand jury investigation, and anything with deciding whether to bring charges, that sort of thing. But he said that there were functions that the DA was carrying out that essentially were investigatory, that didn't have anything to do with his office. And so his ruling was, if the DA is performing functions that are just a regular law enforcement investigation, he didn't have prosecutorial immunity anymore because he's not acting as a prosecutor. So that's kind of a gist of this 35-page ruling or whatever out. And then, so now the case is kind of frozen because this has been appealed. Normally, you can't appeal until there's a final judgment, and then the side that loses, they can go in and appeal. But in certain cases, you can take up what they call an interlocutory appeal, where you're saying, this ruling is wrong, and this ruling is going to have a great impact on this case going forward. So the DA has appealed, and the 11th Circuit in Atlanta is now reviewing whether or not this immunity is actually broader, and that the plaintiffs have countersued, and they've asked the appeals court to say that all of their claims should be reinstated. And I believe the DA just in the past week filed his brief on this. So it'll probably be a little while before we get a ruling out of the 11th Circuit. And then depending on what it is, the case will move forward. In fact, probably regardless of what it is, either the entire case will move forward or just the narrow portion. Or I guess if they rule that the DA is completely immune, the suit will continue against other defendants that have been named in that. But that is the genesis of it. And this is, this is really a case that balances, two really fundamental rights in our system. I mean, the right to a free press and the public being able to know what their government's doing and all that. And then really the right and the necessity of a grand jury to conduct its business in secret. And we can talk about that, but there are good reasons why grand jury secrecy is a thing.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. I also wanted to ask, one of the things we see about this idea of, well, we can write down this law and then that will become the law of the land. And that seems like a good thing. We go back again to our history lesson. We're hearing about a written constitution. But one of the things, even going back to last week's episode, when we were talking about Sir Edward Coke, and at some point, it comes down to the people that interpret those laws. And so when you write down a law, the power shifts from the legislators to those interpreting the laws, which are going to be your judges, right? Who are understanding that. And so the question is, from a liberty perspective, did we just move where that that ownership of your rights go to, from the legislator to the judiciary. We're seeing that, and I'm asking you this specifically. I'm leading you to this here. You mentioned it earlier about the differences between Florida and Alabama having cameras in the courtroom. And in Florida, the judge has to, if I'm getting this right, that they have to come up with a reason, a justification to keep the cameras out. Where in Alabama, as you said, you can't even bring the cameras in.
Right. Yeah, and technically, cameras are not banned in Alabama. There's no state law that says you can't have cameras in the courtroom. The way it works is it's at the discretion of the judges. And in fact, at one point, they did have cameras in the courtroom. I've seen old clips from our station from the 1970s. They had cameras in the courtroom there. And there was no law that was passed. The judges just decided, I guess, that it would create too much of a circus or intimidate witnesses. Or, I mean, people come up with, you hear this all the time in the federal system where they don't have cameras, fears that, what will happen if they put them in. I mean, to me, I say that any argument you can come up with can be refuted by the fact that this is already done in certain parts of our country. They make cases all the time in Florida. They are able to complete criminal investigations. They're able to put people on trial, get convictions, and they're able to do it all. Even though there's a camera there, it's very stark for us to see because our market includes both Florida and Alabama, and the culture is enormously different. So in Florida, the way it works is the first station that asks to record it gets to have their camera in. So there's one camera, and then he has to be the pool photographer and make it available to anyone else who wants it. And it works pretty well, honestly. I mean, I think people are, lawyers and judges are used to it because they've done it for a long time there, so they don't really bat an eye. And I don't really think that witnesses really think much either. You see a camera, I think you kind of pause and then you kind of quickly forget that it's there. So theoretically, we could have cameras, and from time to time, these stations, request permission, and we're always told no. At least in Mobile County, and honestly, I'm not really aware of any other jurisdiction that does it differently than this. Now, as I said before, you can at least see what's going on because you can shoot through the window, and you can't even do that in federal court. You can't even bring the camera into the building, so you don't get that level of transparency. But it goes beyond just cameras in the courtroom. The whole notion of public records. Florida is a very famously open book state when it comes to public records. If you remember back to the Bush v. Gore hanging Chad dispute over the election, it was such an open state that after that election was over, when a consortium of newspapers wanted to get access to the ballots and count them themselves, they were able to get them. I could say with reasonable certainty that never would be allowed in Alabama. and a lot of people assume that the Florida law is so much better. Well, Florida, we need a strong sunshine law, just like they have in Florida. But the laws, what's written down on paper, this gets to your point, what's written down on paper is almost identical. It's not that their law is really any better. It's just that judges have allowed a lot of more exceptions here. And one of the most famous ones recently is body camera footage. In Florida, something happens, even an officer-involved shooting, which is very sensitive. You ask for the body cam footage, and you get it pretty quickly. Here, traditionally we always had to fight for it. This station actually, before I got here, sued the city of Mobile to get access to a body cam footage, and we won at the trial court level, and they decided not to appeal, so they actually gave it to us. But it took a lot of money and a lot of fighting. And then a few years after that, a local newspaper here in Mobile, a weekly paper, sued Baldwin County, which is on the other side of Mobile Bay, for access to sheriff's office body camera during a high-speed chase in a a fatal crash, and they wanted to see that. Well, they took that all the way to the state Supreme Court, which ruled in 2021 that body camera footage is not a public record in Alabama. And again, that's not because the legislature passed a law saying we're exempting this from the open records law. This was just the judges decided that it was an exception, and came out with this ruling saying that balancing the need to protect the integrity of an investigation with the public's right to know, we conclude that this does not fall under the Open Records Act in Alabama. But they said that, this didn't mean that you couldn't give it up. It just means that you don't have to. And in fact, the justice who wrote the majority opinion in that case did something I don't think I've ever seen a state court justice or a U.S. Supreme Court justice to do. He wrote a concurring opinion to his own majority opinion just to emphasize that this is something that we anticipate will be used with discretion and rarely. And, the cities and counties will err on the side of openness, and the public will usually be able to get this. And it will, this will only apply to rare cases where its premature release actually will affect an investigation. We expect it to be used that way. And then, of course, it was completely concurring opinion was completely ignored. And it's the policy now of most agencies, City of Mobile, Police Department for sure, the sheriff's offices here, but most in the state, they just have blank policy. They just don't release it ever. They don't release it even after an investigation is over. Even if it's not tied to a criminal investigation at all, they just don't release it ever. So,
yeah, I mean, if you don't have to, the risk reward calculation for the police department is why even put anybody at risk? There could be something that was never even saw in there, was innocuous to most people, but could then be used against that officer, could be used against the department. So why even put that risk out there if I don't have?
And my suspicion is most of the time, the body camera footage, I think, exonerates allegations of wrongdoing by police. But police resisted this for a long time. And then I think at a certain point, most law enforcement agencies and officers started embracing it because it really was a good protection. Police officers are the subject of a lot of frivolous complaints. People don't like getting arrested. People don't like when police officers exercise their authority on them. And I think a lot of times, they have these complaints, and when they have video evidence that they can point to, and it usually exonerates. It's just that we don't get to see as the public. And I think it would look really bad if a police department said, here's the video, watch it. We did nothing wrong. And then they said, well, we're not going to release it this time. That'd look really bad. Whereas if they just, we never release it. And then they just have to try. And, politicians, police, people in charge, they often talk about these instruments in the context of transparency. We have body cameras to be transparent. Well, it's not very transparent if the public never gets to see it. Maybe transparency on the when it comes to the officer and the supervisor, but it undercuts the argument for public transparency when you don't get to see it. So anyway, that's and that's one example. I mean, there's a whole bunch of court rulings over the years that have made it difficult to get public information. I mean, another one, we're talking about grand juries. The district attorney here takes the position that anything that's evidence at a grand jury proceeding cannot be released, which means that we don't get, and again, this is statewide. I don't want to pick on just Mobile County's district attorney because they all do this. You cannot get an autopsy report if the district attorney says it's part of a grand jury investigation. So, that somebody dies, there's an autopsy conducted, the state lab produces a report. You would think you'd be able to see this. And if it's just some accident and you request a report and pay the fee, you get it. But if it's anything that's being sent to the grand jury, you can't see the report. And to me, it's my personal opinion, I think that's an abuse of what the grand jury secrecy law is supposed to be for. We talked about legitimate reasons for having it. I mean, you want the people who are serving on the grand jury to be secret because you don't want them to be subject to harassment, and you want them to be able to evaluate their work in secret because they're going to be presented information that could damage someone's reputation. If they decide that they're going to no bill a case and they're not going to bring a charge, and that becomes open, then you can unfairly malign someone's reputation for something that never even resulted in charges. And I think that's reasonable. They're deliberations. When the jury's deliberating, you don't want anyone watching over their shoulder because you want them to be able to make an honest decision, free from any outside influences. But then to extend that to saying, well, anything the grand jury might look at, you also can't see. um, doesn't make sense to me. And as the press association lawyer here put it to me, it would be like saying that a grand jury is investigating a local town for some kind of, corrupt spending. And the town's budget is part of the evidence that you're looking at, and so therefore we can't see what the town's budget is. If you took that logic to its extreme, you can't see the town's budget because it's subject to a grand jury investigation. And I think that's silly. But
Be careful. You're going to give Congress ideas. I want to make sure that no congressmen are listening to that.
And it also brings up the larger liberty question of what makes you free in a society. What is it about the American government that guarantees our liberty? And Antonin Scalia had a great monologue on this years ago when he was testifying before a congressional committee. And he said, "What is it?" He said, "I ask people this all the time. Why is it that we're free in the United States?" And people say, "Well, it's the First Amendment or it's the Bill of Rights." And he said, "It's none of that." And he made the point, the Constitution is just words on a paper. The Declaration of Independence, the First Amendment, that has no meaning at all. It's just ink on parchment. And he made the point that the Soviet Union, at the time he was testifying, I believe it was still the Soviet Union, he said, they have a great constitution. He said, you go read the Soviet constitution, it's better than ours in a lot of ways. He said, truly, it is better. It is great. People will get to elect the representatives to represent their interests. They will be free to speak their minds. They can assemble and protest their government. I mean, if you just read the words, you would think that the Soviet Union had this free and open system. And he said it was not, because there was one power source that dominated the entire country. And when you have that, then there's going to be no meaning behind any of the words in your constitution. He said what makes us free is the structure of our government that divides power and puts people against each other. And it's really hard to pass laws because you have to get it through not just one house of Congress, but then another house, and then it's subject to a veto by the president. And the president has a lot of powers, but has to go to Congress to get things done. And then there's a separate judicial branch that is, lifetime appointment, right? A lot of people don't like this lifetime tenure, but if you have a lifetime tenure job, you don't owe anyone anything anymore. So you don't have to worry about whether you're going to get another appointment to another term, depending on how you roll. And then that doesn't even talk about the power that's divided and sent to the states. And, we've seen obviously a lot of state attorneys general have not been shy about defending their powers in lawsuits against the Trump administration. So anyway, that's Scalia's view. Is that's what makes us free, is that structure where no one faction or force can become dominant. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. If you have all the power, the temptation to wield it is great. And regardless of what the words on the paper say.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Brendan. That was fantastic. Yes, that Antonin Scalia's speech is fantastic. The separation of powers, the federalism, the bicameral legislation, all of that, and he even compares it to to other European countries and powers, and it's really that structure. And we talked about that a little bit earlier, and talking about the lessons from Polybius and how you can forestall the degradation of rule, right? From democracy or from oligarchy to allocracy, all of that. All of those points are what our founders had in mind. And I think that's why it's so important that we continue to keep those lessons in play and we don't allow power to continue to accumulate in one branch or the other, that we keep this separation of power, these checks and balances that have made us so strong. And as you've reported on, that happens not just at the federal level, it happens at the state level, it happens at the local level. And I think that's why it's so important that viewers, whether they're in Mobile, Alabama, whether they're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, whether they're in Paducah, Kentucky, that they do understand what's happening in their local municipalities, that they are watching, that they are learning, that they are keeping transparency for the people that they're electing. What is your advice to them? How can they find information in their local communities? What should they be watching? What should they be reading? What should they be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say pay attention to local news sources that exist, and as we've talked about, it's not as robust as it once was. Newspapers. A lot of newspapers have gone out of business. Newspapers that are around, in a lot of cases, are just kind of hanging on by the thread. So they literally don't have as many people doing it. And TV stations have been affected by the same economic constraints as well. But there are still, mainstream legitimate sources out there that are covering local government, and you should pay attention to that. I mean, just kind of as a baseline. I mean, a lot of people just don't really pay attention to any of it, and don't even know the things that are being reported. It's a whole nother issue that there are things maybe that aren't being reported, but start with the stuff that is being reported that is easy to do. And then obviously, if you've got the time and wherewithal to go to some city council meetings, and I understand people are busy. A lot of times these bodies meet when they're at work. That's not possible, but if you can. And then there are non-traditional sites that keep up with this sort of thing. There's a guy down here who just has a Facebook page called Downtown Mobile Today. I believe he's a retired journalist who just started doing this because he was bored, and very prolific, and puts up a lot of things that are really just kind of old school journalism. He looks through planning commission documents and zoning documents, and a lot of these meetings, here and elsewhere in the country are live streamed, so you don't even have to go to them, and you can watch them there. And he's done a really great job talking about new businesses that are coming, proposed projects, just kind of neighborhood type news for the downtown area. But frankly, no one was really doing. We don't have a daily print newspaper anymore, so that newspaper of record stuff is has kind of gone away. And so anyway, every community has stuff like this. I just say seek them out. But it's hard. It's hard to be a good voter because it's hard to really know what's going on. And I think a lot of people base their votes on party labels and in the bigger races, TV ads. And but if you want to dig beyond that, sometimes you have to work pretty hard to find out, more than that superficial level. I mean, it would be nice if there was a business model that promoted more reporting on that. But, as I've said, I mean, you've got a finite number of ad dollars, which funds this. And, when, you can start your own site for $100, a limited number of people in it. And that's what I'm saying. It's not like anyone decided, well, we're, don't like newspapers anymore, so we're going to go them away. It's just, Craigslist came along like that, and overnight took away classified ads, which used to be about a quarter of a newspaper's revenue. And it was an enormous cash cow. It was, you didn't even have to go out and solicit them. People would come to you. All you needed to do is hire some low paid clerks to take the calls and transcribe the ad and then collect the money. And those little classified ads were not cheap. But you can't beat free. So that went away. And then big corporations that used to buy these huge display ads in newspapers decided, well, let's take part of our ad budget and throw it into these, this new emerging, media and websites. So anyway, the advertising pie is more or less the same in terms of the advertising dollars available, and that pie is just divided over a much larger area. And then on the other side, when we had 3 TV channels in a city and PBS and a UHF station, the ratings were really high. I would love to see what the rating share were like for the local news, in 1985, because now there are so many choices.
Awesome. Very good. Well, thank you, Brendan. We appreciate you being on the show. Hope to have you back sometime soon in the future, and a lot of great insights that we got to go through this week. Really appreciate it. Welcome back. That was my conversation with Brendan Kirby, and I want to take a few minutes to recap and address some technical difficulties we had at the end of our session. First of all, I'm grateful for Brendan for his time and for addressing the leveler questions the way he did with us today. He gave the best definition of his trade that I've heard, and it's an old Orwell quote. Journalism is telling people what people in power do not want them to know, and everything else is public relations. And what Brendan added to this week was a mechanism. The Saturday episode argues that writing a limit down moves the argument to a smaller room rather than closing it. Brendan gave that room an address and a docket number, and 30 years of watching who walks into it. Brendan got to the liberty question before I did, and he answered it through Scalia. Scalia said in testimony, the Soviet Constitution read better than our own. But what made the difference was not the words, but rather a structure that sets power against power, checks and balances, federal and state prerogative, a bicameral legislature, an independent executive, and an unelected Supreme Court to judge constitutional issues free of popularity contests. I think that is right. So let me put our own question to something narrower and see where the structure held. On this show, we close by asking one question of everything we examine. Did this leave people more free or more governed? Well, in 2021, the Alabama Supreme Court held that police body camera footage is not a public record under the state's open records law. The case for holding that is stronger than the people who share my instincts usually admit. Releasing footage while an investigation is open lets witnesses shape their accounts to match what they have already watched. The recordings capture people who are accused of nothing, bystanders, victims, children, and inside the private house on the worst night of somebody's life, none of whom consented to be filmed. And in a small county, footage released before charges are filed can poison the only jury pool that there is. Now, those are real interests, and a fair trial is one of them. But look at what the court actually did. It did not order agencies to withhold. It held that they need not release. Discretion was the entire design, and the justice who wrote the majority opinion was so concerned that the point be understood that he wrote separately, concurring with himself, to say that the exemption should be used rarely and that cities and counties should err toward openness. Brendan reports that the concurrence was ignored and that the blanket refusal is now the standard policy. Footage withheld after an investigation closes and withheld where no investigation exists. So a legislature wrote an open records law, a court wrote a limit on it, a justice wrote a limit on his own limit. 3 layers of writing, and the practice went the other way anyway. Meanwhile, Brenda tells me the Florida statute reads almost exactly the same as Alabama's, and in Florida, you ask for the footage and you get it. Same words, opposite outcome. This is more governed. And not because anybody defied the paper. Everyone followed the paper. That is the leveler problem, still unresolved. Last week, we found Koch unable to answer what controls the legislature. This week, the levelers could not answer who interprets the protections. Writing the limit down was not the mistake. It was necessary, and it is not sufficient. And no one has closed that gap in over 400 years. Next week, we take up Algernon Sidney and John Locke, a man executed for a manuscript he never published, and a man whose argument about consent ended up inside the Declaration of Independence. My guest that week will be Thomas Lane, the Greene County attorney in Iowa and the Libertarian candidate for the United States Senate. Before he was a prosecutor, he taught constitutional law and political philosophy, and he taught Locke for years. This week, we asked what a written limit is worth. Next week, we ask where the right to define one comes from at all. Two things I did not get to ask Brendan before our connection gave out. His book is called Wicked Mobile. That is the full title. 300 Years of the Rogues and Scoundrels of Mobile and the Communities Around it. You can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever books are sold. And you can follow his reporting at fox10tv.com. If you live anywhere on the Gulf Coast, from Mobile across to Pensacola and Baldwin County, the Fox 10 News app is worth having on your phone for news, weather, and what is happening where you live. One thing Brendan said that is not about Alabama. Every listener has a county commission, a school board, a police department, and a court that runs on records somebody has to go and ask for. Find out whether anyone in your town is still asking. Until then, keep asking the question that matters. Did this leave us more free or more governed? I am Jeff Kellick. This has been Consequential Actions. And until next time, have a great day.